King Valerius of the Night Court, Lord of the Crimson Throne, Sovereign of the Onyx Spires, and a litany of other titles that took a full minute for a herald to announce, was having a very bad millennium. It had all started so promisingly. The celestial alignments, the prophecies scrawled in blood on the obsidian scrolls, the undeniable, soul-deep thrum in his own petrified heart all pointed to one glorious, inescapable conclusion: he had found her. His fated mate. The one being in all of existence destined to be his queen, his partner, the light to his eternal darkness. Her name was Ilara. And she was, to put it in the most generous terms Valerius could muster, a logistical and emotional nightmare. His first sight of her had been exactly as the prophecies foretold. She was walking through the market square of Oakhaven, the bustling port city that grudgingly paid him tribute. Sunlight, his ancient foe, dared to catch in her brown hair, revealing strands of warm chestnut. She was arguing with a fishmonger, her hands planted firmly on her hips, her voice a cascade of unimpressed, pragmatic observations about the freshness of his wares. Valerius had descended from the shadows of a nearby spire, a wisp of smoke and ancient power, his heart, a purely decorative organ for the last 9 centuries, performing a sensation remarkably like a kick drum solo. He had expected gasps. Or perhaps a respectable swoon. Ilara had glanced at him, taken in his flowing black silk, his silver-chased armor, and the palpable aura of dread that made lesser men soil their breeches, and said to the fishmonger, "Fine, I'll take the cod, but if it smells even slightly off when I get it home, I'm bringing it back." "And him," she added, hooking a thumb in Valerius's direction, "him and his dramatic cape will be my witnesses." Valerius had been so utterly baffled, he had simply vanished back into the shadows without a word, the scent of questionable cod filling his supernaturally keen senses. This was not the reunion foretold in the scrolls. The scrolls had mentioned weeping, declarations of eternal love, and a profound, soul-shattering recognition. They had not mentioned a pending seafood dispute. Still, he was a king. A king of immense power and theatricality. He would court her. He would win her. He would shower her with gestures so grand, so magnificent, that she would have no choice but to fall into his arms. This, he would later reflect while staring at a formal cease and desist order from his own council, was his first catastrophic mistake. His campaign of courtship began a week later. An ambassador from the neighboring kingdom of Silveria, a pompous elf with ears that could pick up a whisper from a league away, had the misfortune of jostling Ilara as she exited the city's public ledger office. The elf hadn't apologized, he'd merely sneered at her simple wool cloak. Valerius, observing from his throne via a scrying pool filled with the tears of fallen angels, a dramatic but surprisingly effective medium, felt a surge of cold, protective fury. The disrespect was intolerable. His queen had been slighted. Retribution must be swift, unequivocal, and, of course, visually spectacular. That evening, a 10-mile stretch of the Silverian border forest, a place of ancient and storied beauty, erupted in a blaze of violet, supernatural flame that burned without consuming, casting an eerie glow visible from his highest tower. It was a message, written in lilac fire: "Tread carefully, for you have offended a queen." He expected Ilara to be impressed. Awed. Perhaps a little frightened, but in a thrilling, romantic way. He found her the next day in the town square, not looking up at the distant, magical glow, but staring furiously at a trade notice board. "Do you have any idea," she began, not even turning to face him as he materialized at her side, "what the price of Silverian lumber is going to do now?" Valerius blinked. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. "The price of lumber is of no consequence. An insult was delivered, and it has been answered." "Answered? You set their primary economic asset on fire." She finally turned to him, her eyes flashing with an emotion he couldn't quite place. It wasn't awe. It was exasperation. "That wasn't an answer, you celestial moron, it was an act of economic terrorism. The Carpenters' Guild is in an uproar. The Fletchers are panicking. Not to mention the ecological impact. Do you know how many species of rare, phosphorescent moss were in that forest?" Valerius was, for the second time in as many weeks, struck completely dumb. He had laid down a challenge to a rival kingdom, a gesture of power and devotion spoken in the language of kings. She was giving him a lecture on supply chain management and glowing fungus. "The elf was rude to you," he managed, his voice a low growl that usually sent shivers of fear down the spines of his generals. "He was a jerk, yes," Ilara conceded, crossing her arms. "So I called him a pointy-eared prig and went about my day." The appropriate response was a sharp retort, not destabilizing the entire region's timber market. "What were you thinking?" He was thinking that she looked magnificent when she was angry, her face flushed and her eyes bright. He was thinking that no one had dared speak to him this way in centuries. He was thinking that this was significantly more complicated than the prophecies had led him to believe. "I was thinking of your honor," he said, trying to regain some semblance of regal authority. "My honor is not tied to the gross domestic product of a neighboring kingdom," she shot back. "Next time someone's rude to me, just let me handle it. I'm very good at it. Now if you'll excuse me, I have to go stockpile charcoal before the price goes through the roof." "Thanks," she added with withering sarcasm, "for the help." She stormed off, leaving him standing alone in the square. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth, their fear of him now mingled with a new, and frankly insulting, emotion, pity. Valerius watched her go, a strange and unsettling thought worming its way into his ancient mind. Perhaps grand gestures required a more nuanced approach. His second attempt at courtship was, by his own estimation, far more targeted. More personal. He had learned his lesson. No more international incidents. This would be a simple, direct act of justice in her name. He observed her again, this time as she was purchasing fabric for a new dress. The merchant, a man named Tiberius with a reputation for greed that was almost as vast as his shipping fleet, had recognized her as the woman seen with the Vampire King. Seeing an opportunity, he had tripled the price of a bolt of simple blue linen. Ilara, of course, was having none of it. Valerius watched, fascinated, as she systematically dismantled the merchant's pricing structure with a series of pointed questions and a frighteningly detailed knowledge of textile import tariffs. But Tiberius was arrogant. He refused to budge. "This is the price," he'd sneered. "Take it or leave it. Surely your dark patron can afford it." The insult was twofold, to her intelligence and to his generosity. Valerius's cold fury returned, this time with a chilling focus. The merchant had not just overcharged his fated queen, he had implied Valerius was a neglectful provider. The offense was intimate. It demanded a personal, devastating response. That night, under a sliver of moon, Valerius did not burn anything. He was more subtle. He simply acquired. Using his dominion over shadows and mist, he and a handful of his most loyal guard silently boarded every vessel in Tiberius's fleet as they lay at anchor in the harbor. The crews were put to sleep with a whisper of magic, and by dawn, the entire Tiberius mercantile fleet, all 12 galleons, 17 caravels, and 32 assorted barges had vanished from Oakhaven's harbor. They were now sitting in a hidden, mist-shrouded cove 100 leagues up the coast, guarded by ancient sea specters sworn to his service. He imagined Ilara waking to the news. She would hear that the greedy merchant who had tried to swindle her had been mysteriously, utterly ruined overnight. She would understand that he, Valerius, was her champion, her protector in all things, great and small. She would surely appreciate this direct, poetic justice. He found her by the docks, surrounded by a wailing, panicked crowd. She was not looking triumphant. She was holding a ledger and looked like she was about to have an aneurysm. "You," she hissed, spotting him as he coalesced from a patch of shade cast by a crane. She grabbed his arm, an act of casual physical contact that sent a jolt of lightning through his veins, and dragged him behind a stack of barrels that smelled faintly of brine and desperation. "Put them back," she ordered, her voice low and furious. Valerius drew himself up. "I have no idea what you are talking about." "Oh, don't you?" The entire mercantile fleet of the city's largest shipping magnate vanishes without a trace the night after he overcharges me for 3 yards of linen, and you have no idea what I'm talking about. "Put the ships back." "Justice has been served," Valerius stated, his tone brooking no argument. "He sought to cheat you. He has paid the price. He paid the price. He paid the price." She gestured wildly at the chaotic docks. There are 2,000 sailors, stevedores, shipwrights, and clerks out of a job this morning. The harbour master is having a breakdown. The Merchants' Guild is about to declare bankruptcy. The city's entire economy is dependent on that fleet. You didn't punish Tiberius, you just torpedoed the livelihood of a quarter of the city's population. Valerius stared at her, his mind struggling to process the cascade of information. He had seen a single insult. An offense against his mate. He had surgically removed the offender from the equation. He had not considered the ripples. The labyrinthine network of dependencies and consequences that radiated outward from a single merchant. It was like trying to understand an ant colony by swatting a single ant. But, his disrespect, Valerius stammered, feeling for the first time in centuries that he was not in control of the conversation. His disrespect cost me an extra 7 silver pieces, which I refused to pay, by the way, she snapped. Your justice is about to cost the city thousands in gold, not to mention the looming food shortages now that the grain shipments have stopped. Do you understand the concept of proportionality at all? He did not. The concept was entirely foreign to him. In his world, there was only utter loyalty or complete annihilation. There was no middle ground. Proportionality was for lesser beings. For bookkeepers. Beings like Ilara. I acted to defend your honor, he insisted, falling back on his most reliable motivation. Stop defending my honor, she cried, throwing her hands up in the air. My honor is fine. It's sturdy. It doesn't need you to declare economic war on my behalf every time someone looks at me funny. Please, for the love of all that is holy, just stop helping. She looked so utterly, genuinely distressed. Not impressed, not awed, not romantically terrified. Just tired. And stressed. He had tried to lift a burden from her shoulders and had instead dropped an entire shipping fleet on her head. A strange, uncomfortable emotion pricked at him. It felt like failure. It was a novel and deeply unpleasant sensation. The ships will be returned by nightfall, he said, his voice clipped. The merchant will find his coffers mysteriously empty. A more proportional punishment. Ilara sighed, the fight draining out of her. Thank you. And the money you take from him? I will distribute it amongst the city's poor, he said, improvising wildly. She looked at him, a flicker of something other than rage in her eyes. It might have been surprise. Okay, she said softly. Okay, that's better. He watched her walk back toward the crowd, already starting to organize a relief effort for the temporarily unemployed workers. She moved with a purpose and competence that he was beginning to realize was far more formidable than any army. He had failed again. But this time, he had learned something. Nuance. Proportionality. And the terrifyingly complex concept of a municipal economy. His next gesture, he vowed, would be perfect. It would be grand, yes, but it would also be undeniably just. It would be a gesture no one, not even Ilara, with her strange obsession with consequences, could possibly fault. It was this line of thinking that led him, 1 week later, to declare war on the sovereign nation of Eldoria. The catalyst was, in hindsight, tragically predictable. A diplomat from Eldoria, a kingdom of sun-worshipping zealots with a historical hatred of all things nocturnal, had been visiting Oak Haven. At a public reception, he had seen Valerius speaking with Ilara in a quiet corner. The diplomat, full of wine and sanctimony, had laughed and referred to Ilara in a voice loud enough for half the room to hear as the Vampire King's new mortal pet. Valerius's world had gone silent and cold. The insult was not to him. It was not about lumber or linen. It was about her. Her status. Her very being. The diplomat had reduced her, his fated queen, the magnificent, infuriating, brilliant woman who lectured him on economics, to a mere plaything. This was not a slight to be answered with burning trees or confiscated ships. This was a fundamental attack on her dignity. This demanded a response of overwhelming, earth-shattering force. This demanded war. Before dawn, his declaration, written in ink of blood and silver on the flayed skin of a traitor, was delivered to the Eldorian capital. His legions, shadows given form and fang, began to march. He informed Ilara via a raven carrying a scroll tied with a black silk ribbon. My dearest Ilara, the note read, in his elegant, looping script. Your honor has been impugned in the most vile of ways. I have, therefore, declared war upon the offending nation of Eldoria. I ride to battle in your name. Yours, in eternal devotion, Valerius. He had expected. Well, at this point, he wasn't sure what he expected. Perhaps a grudging admiration for his decisiveness. Perhaps a concerned plea for his safety. What he got was silence. For 3 days, there was no word from her. He assumed she was overwhelmed by the grandeur of it all, perhaps penning a heartfelt sonnet to his Valer. On the 4th day, as he was reviewing troop movements with his top general, a pale-faced, trembling vampire from the Home Guard arrived via portal, clutching a sealed black envelope. A summons, my king, the vampire stammered, refusing to meet his eyes. From the council. Valerius was taken aback. The Vampire Council, a body of ancient, semi-petrified elders who hadn't convened in over a century, had summoned him. They only met for matters of the most critical importance, the breaking of the ancient covenants, a threat to their entire species, or a particularly egregious breach of their foundational laws. Launching a war against the sun worshippers of Eldoria hardly qualified. It was practically a national pastime. Annoyed but duty-bound, he returned to his capital, striding into the council chamber with an air of impatient authority. The 7 elders were seated around the obsidian table, their faces looking even more prune-like than usual. Before the Lord Elder, on a velvet cushion, sat a single, incongruous object, a small, wooden box with a slot in the top. It was dusty and looked like it hadn't been opened since the dawn of time. Lord Valerius, the Lord Elder began, his voice like the grinding of tombstones. We have received a complaint. Valerius raised an eyebrow. A complaint? A formal grievance, the elder clarified, gesturing a skeletal hand toward the box. Lodged via the appropriate, if long dormant, channels. Specifically, through the fated mate complaint box. Valerius stared at the box. He vaguely recalled its existence from his history lessons centuries ago. It was an archaic legal mechanism, a loophole created to protect mates from overzealous or tyrannical partners, but it was considered a myth, a joke. No one had ever actually used it. A grievance, the elder continued, picking up a piece of crisp, modern parchment that looked utterly alien in the ancient chamber. Filed by one Ilara of Oakhaven. He cleared his throat and began to read. Grievance filed against King Valerius of the Night Court for a pattern of unsolicited, disproportionate, and frankly unhinged romantic gestures. The words hung in the dead air of the chamber. Valerius felt the blood drain from his face, a truly bizarre sensation for a vampire. The elder went on, his dry voice lending a surreal gravity to Ilara's prose. Incident Alpha, arson of the Silverian border forest. Complaint, ecological devastation, severe disruption of regional timber trade. Unsolicited. Incident Bravo, grand theft of the Tiberius mercantile fleet. Complaint, reckless endangerment of a municipal economy, causing mass unemployment and civic panic. Unsolicited. Incident Charlie, declaration of war against the sovereign nation of Eldoria. The elder paused, peering over the parchment at Valerius. Complaint, are you kidding me? This has to stop. It's embarrassing. Another elder picked up a second sheet. She has also included a section titled Desired Resolution. Point 1, a formal cease and desist order to be placed upon King Valerius, effective immediately, barring him from initiating any further romantic gestures that involve arson, theft, economic destabilization, or acts of war. Point 2, mandatory attendance at a remedial course on appropriate courtship rituals, to be administered by the complainant. Point 3, he has to call off the war. Obviously. Valerius stood frozen, a statue of pure, unadulterated shock. He had been served. He, the Lord of the Crimson Throne, had been served with a legal complaint by his own fated mate, treating him not as a king, but as a misbehaving tenant in a boarding house. The Lord Elder sighed, a sound like dust settling on a coffin lid. The ancient laws are clear, Valerius. The rights of a fated mate are absolute. The complaint is valid. You are hereby ordered to cease all hostilities with Eldoria. You are to make no further gestures without her express written consent. The council has spoken. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through Valerius's shock. He had been publicly, legally, and bureaucratically neutered by a woman who haggled over fish. And yet, beneath the humiliation, another emotion flickered. A strange, unfamiliar spark of admiration. No one had ever dared to challenge him. Armies had tried and failed. Rival lords had schemed and been crushed. But Ilara hadn't raised an army. She had found a dusty old rulebook and beaten him over the head with it. He turned and strode from the chamber, his mind a whirlwind. He wasn't going to the battlefield. He was going to Oak Haven. He needed to have a word with his complainant. Ilara was in her small, tidy apartment above a bakery. The air smelled of yeast and cooling bread. She was sitting at her kitchen table, poring over a ledger, a quill tucked behind her ear. She didn't seem surprised when he appeared in the center of her room, having bypassed the door entirely by stepping through the shadows. She looked up, her expression not fearful, but weary, like a parent about to address a child who had just painted the cat. "So," she said, setting down her quill. "Did you get my note?" "I was summoned before the council," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I have been publicly censured. My war has been halted. My authority has been undermined." "Good," she said, nodding. "Then the system works. Would you like some tea?" The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it left him breathless. He stalked toward the table, his presence filling the small room, his shadow swallowing the candlelight. "You filed a complaint against me. You used an archaic bylaw to humiliate me in front of my own elders." "I did," she confirmed, completely unperturbed. "It was either that or let you commit genocide in my honor, and frankly, my honor was feeling pretty nauseous about the whole thing. I see it as a form of constructive feedback." "Constructive feedback," he echoed, his voice rising. "You have treated a declaration of eternal devotion as if it were a poorly executed business merger. That's because your romantic gestures have the same net effect as a poorly executed business merger," she retorted, finally getting to her feet to face him. "Widespread panic, economic collapse, and a lot of people getting fired. Or, in this case, killed." They stood there, inches apart, the air crackling with tension. He was a creature of immense power, capable of leveling cities. She was a mortal woman in a small apartment that smelled of bread. And for the life of him, he couldn't understand why he wasn't winning this argument. "I do not understand you," he admitted, the anger draining away, replaced by pure, unadulterated bewilderment. "Everything I have done for you." "I know," she said, and her voice softened. "That's the problem. You're trying to speak a language I don't understand. It's like you're shouting poetry at me in a hurricane. The sentiment might be lovely, but all I'm getting is wet and deafened." She sighed and rubbed her temples. "Look. Sit down. I think it's time for your performance review." He stared at her. "My, what?" "Your performance review," she repeated, gesturing to the other chair at the small table. "As a suitor. Sit." Against his better judgment, against every instinct honed over 1,000 years of unquestioned command, King Valerius Saturday. Ilara pulled a fresh sheet of parchment towards her and picked up her quill. "All right. Let's start with gesture number 1, the Silverian border fire." She looked at him expectantly. "Objective?" Valerius felt as if he had stumbled into a play where he was the only one who hadn't been given a script. The objective was to demonstrate that any insult to you would be met with overwhelming power. "Okay," Ilara said, scribbling a note. "A show of force." And the result? The Silverian ambassador was recalled in disgrace. They have been silent since he felt a flash of pride. The core objective had been achieved. Also, the price of wooden furniture tripled, a rare species of fire-resistant salamander is now homeless, and we sparked a minor diplomatic crisis that I had to smooth over with our local trade council by promising them a discount on future iron tariffs, she countered, ticking off points on her fingers. "So, while you succeeded in your primary objective of looking scary, you failed in the secondary, and frankly more important, objectives of not wrecking the economy and not being an absolute menace overall. Grade D-. The minus is for the salamanders. I liked them. Valerius stared at the parchment as if it were a death sentence. A D-. He hadn't received a grade that low since his swordsmanship tutor in the 3rd century critiqued his parry. Next, Ilara said, her tone brisk. Gesture number 2, the Great Fleet Heist. The merchant Tiberius was punished for his avarice and his disrespect, Valerius stated, his jaw tight. He was, Ilara agreed. But so were 2,000 dockworkers, their families, and the entire commercial sector of Oakhaven. Your punishment was like using a tidal wave to extinguish a candle. Effective, I suppose, but the collateral damage is absurd. You get points for returning the ships and redistributing Tiberius's wealth. That was a nice touch, a glimmer of competence, but you lose most of them for causing the problem in the first place. Grade, C. You passed, but just barely. See me after class. He was going to be ill. A C. Average. He, Valerius, was average. And finally, she said, her voice turning serious. Gesture number 3, the Eldorian War. She put her quill down and looked him straight in the eye. Valerius. You declared war. He called you a pet, Valerius growled, the memory of the insult still coiling in his gut. He was an idiot in a gaudy sash, Ilara said dismissively. His opinion means nothing to me. But the lives of thousands of soldiers, both yours and theirs, mean a great deal. You can't just launch an invasion as a romantic gesture. It's not a box of chocolates. It's a geopolitical cataclysm. There is no metric by which this is an acceptable act of courtship. Grade, F for spectacular, resounding F. You are on academic probation. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Your overall performance as a suitor is, to be blunt, abysmal. You are failing this class. You may have the passion, but you have zero technique, zero understanding of the material, and a complete disregard for the consequences of your actions. Valerius sat in stunned silence. For 1,000 years, his actions had been his will made manifest. He thought, he acted, the world changed. No one had ever dared to critique his methods. No one had ever suggested that there were consequences beyond his immediate desires. He had seen the world as a chessboard, and himself as the player. Ilara was pointing out the board was on fire, the pieces were screaming, and the whole table was about to collapse. He felt the foundations of his entire worldview begin to crumble. Everything he knew about power, about devotion, about honor, was being systematically dismantled by this woman with an accountant's soul and the audacity of a god. And he loved it. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just intrigued by her. He wasn't just smitten. He was utterly, hopelessly, irrevocably in love with her mind, with her courage, with the way she looked at his entire existence and calmly decided it could be managed better. You are right, he said, the words tasting strange and foreign on his tongue. He had never uttered them before in his life. I have failed. Ilara's expression softened. The sharp edges of the unforgiving teacher melted away, revealing the concerned woman beneath. You haven't failed, she corrected gently. You've just been doing it wrong. For a very, very long time, I suspect. Teach me, he said, the words a raw plea. You said the grievance required remedial coursework. I am formally enrolling. Teach me how to do this. How to love you in a way that doesn't involve a body count. A slow smile spread across Ilara's face. It was the first genuine, unguarded smile he had ever received from her, and it was more dazzling than 1,000 burning forests. All right, Your Majesty, she said, picking up her quill again. Lesson 1 begins tomorrow. And bring a notebook. There will be a quiz. Lesson 1 was titled Apologies and Restitution. Ilara insisted that before he could learn any new skills, he had to clean up the messes he'd already made. This led to what Valerius would forever refer to as his grand humiliation tour. Their first stop was the hastily reconvened Silverian embassy. Valerius, dressed in formal but subdued attire at Ilara's insistence, no spiky shoulder guards, you'll put someone's eye out, stood before the new ambassador, a nervous, younger elf who looked like he was about to bolt. Venerable ambassador, Valerius began, his voice echoing with its usual sepulchral authority. I have come to acknowledge the misunderstanding regarding your nation's arboreal assets. The elf flinched. Ilara, standing beside Valerius, cleared her throat pointedly. What he means to say, she interjected, giving Valerius a sharp look, is that he is very, very sorry for setting your forest on fire. It was a rash, impulsive, and frankly idiotic thing to do. Valerius stiffened. I would not have phrased it with such inelegance. Tough, Ilara whispered back. We're not here for elegance, we're here for de-escalation. Now, tell him about the restitution package. Valerius took a deep breath, swallowing a millennium of pride. Furthermore, he continued, his voice strained, as a gesture of my profound regret, I have commissioned a team of my finest shadow weavers and blood mags to He glanced at the note card Ilara had pressed into his hand. To undertake a comprehensive reforestation project. They will use ancient growth magics to restore the woodland to its former glory within a single lunar cycle. We will also be subsidizing your lumber exports for the next 5 years to compensate for any economic disruption. The elf's jaw dropped. Ancient growth magics were a closely guarded secret of the vampire lords, capable of creating in a month what would take nature a century. It was an apology of almost unthinkable value. We accept your majesty's most generous apology, the elf stammered, bowing low. As they left the embassy, Valerius felt a strange lightness. He had bent his knee, metaphorically speaking, and the world had not ended. In fact, he had averted a trade war and possibly earned a grudging ally. That was effective, he conceded. See, Ilara said, patting his arm. Apologizing is just diplomacy for your feelings. It's not that hard for him, it was harder than conquering the Netherhells, but he didn't say that. Lesson 2 was the art of the small gesture. Ilara was determined to teach him that romance did not have to be earth-shattering. Tomorrow, she instructed him, I want you to bring me something beautiful. Something that says you're thinking of me. And the budget is 5 silver pieces. Valerius spent the entire night in a state of profound anxiety. 5 silver pieces. It was an insultingly small sum. It wouldn't even cover the cost of the enchanted ink he used for his correspondence. What could possibly be beautiful and meaningful for such a paltry amount? His first instinct was to find a single, perfect diamond, steal it, and leave 5 silver pieces in its place as a form of ironic compliance. He immediately discarded the idea, imagining the performance review score 4 grand larceny F-, probably. He wandered the pre-dawn markets, a dark, brooding figure amongst the cheerful bakers and flower sellers. He saw nothing worthy. The flowers were mundane, the trinkets gaudy, the pastries, well, the pastries were tempting, but he doubted a nice scone was the grand romantic statement she was looking for. Then he saw it. A street artist was sketching portraits. For 5 silver pieces, she would capture a person's likeness in charcoal. An idea, brilliant and terrifying, formed in his mind. He presented himself to Ilara that afternoon. He didn't have an object in his hands. Did you forget? She asked, a hint of disappointment in her voice. No, he said. He gestured to the street, where the artist was setting up her easel. I did not bring you something beautiful. I brought a means for you to create something beautiful. The artist is at your disposal for the rest of the day. To sketch whatever you wish. A landscape. A portrait of yourself. A particularly charming-looking goat. The choice is yours. He paused, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. The cost was exactly 5 silver pieces. Ilara stared at him, her eyes wide. Then she laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated delight. Valerius, that's brilliant. It's thoughtful. It's creative. And it respects my autonomy. She looked at him with genuine warmth. A+, Your Majesty. He felt a surge of triumph more potent than any victory in battle. An A+. He preened internally, trying to maintain a regal composure. Lesson 3 was the most difficult of all. Active listening. Ilara decreed they would simply spend an afternoon together, talking. There were no grand objectives, no gifts, no diplomatic missions. The goal, she explained, was for him to learn about her, not as a symbol to be defended, but as a person. They sat on a bench overlooking the sea. She told him about her childhood, her dream of opening a free library for the city's children, her frustration with the city's inefficient tax collection system. He found himself utterly captivated. He learned that she had a sharp, analytical mind that saw the world in systems and patterns. She didn't just see a poor family, she saw the flawed economic policies that led to their poverty. She didn't just see a ship in the harbor, she saw the entire network of lives and commerce it represented. In turn, he found himself speaking of his own past. Not the grand histories of his conquests, but the quiet, lonely centuries in his castle. The weight of immortality. The crushing boredom of being surrounded by sycophants who feared him too much to ever truly speak to him. He spoke of the long, silent nights, and the gnawing emptiness that he had mistaken for strength. "It must be lonely," she said softly, her shoulder brushing against his. "Being a king." "It is," he admitted, the truth of it hitting him with fresh force. "I had forgotten what it felt like to have a conversation with an equal." "Well, get used to it," she said, her tone light but her eyes sincere. "Your equal thinks the current grain tariff is a travesty, and we're going to talk about it at length later." He smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I look forward to it." In that quiet moment, surrounded by the scent of salt and the sound of gulls, the lessons stopped feeling like lessons. The banter, the sarcastic remarks, the witty back and forth, it was no longer just a teaching method. It had become their love language. It was how they saw each other, how they challenged each other, how they connected. But one shadow remained. The war with Eldoria. Though he had ceased hostilities, the declaration still stood. The armies were still camped on the border, a festering wound in the continent's side. It was the last, and greatest, of his mistakes. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he couldn't fix it alone. "We need to end the war," he said one evening, as they were looking over city blueprints in her apartment. He had become fascinated by urban planning. "I know," Ilara said, her face serious. "A truce is just a pause button. It needs a proper resolution. An apology will not suffice," he said. The insult was too public. "National pride is at stake. They cannot be seen to bow to me, and I cannot be seen to bow to them. So it's a deadlock," she murmured, tracing the line of a proposed new aqueduct with her finger. "A problem of perception, not of substance. It's a political problem. And political problems are just large-scale accounting. You just have to make sure everyone feels like they've come out ahead, even if all you've done is move the assets around." He looked at her, at the way her mind worked, seeing solutions where he saw only intractable pride. "Help me," he said. "Help me write the treaty." And so they began their final, most important lesson. They worked for weeks, side by side at her small kitchen table. He would explain the ancient histories, the generations of bad blood, the symbolic importance of a particular mountain pass or river valley. She would listen, absorb it all, and then propose pragmatic, elegant solutions. She drafted trade agreements that would benefit both nations, creating mutual prosperity that would make future wars unprofitable. She proposed cultural exchange programs, student scholarships, and joint infrastructure projects. She reframed the entire conflict, not as a matter of honor and insult, but as a colossal, tragic misunderstanding between neighbors. She wrote clauses that allowed the Eldorian king to claim he had taught the Vampire King a lesson in civility, while other clauses allowed Valerius to state he had graciously accepted Eldoria's apology. It was a masterpiece of face-saving, a treaty where everyone got to declare victory. During those long nights, hunched over maps and parchment, their professional partnership bled seamlessly into a personal one. He would watch the way the candlelight flickered in her eyes as she solved a complex trade route problem, and he would feel a wave of adoration so powerful it almost knocked him off his chair. She would catch him staring, and instead of questioning it, she would just smile and slide a cup of freshly brewed tea towards him, made exactly how she'd learned he liked it. One night, as they were finalizing the last clause, her hand brushed his as they both reached for the inkwell. The casual touch lingered. The air grew still. The scratching of the quill was the only sound. "Ilara," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She looked up, her gaze meeting his. The wit and sarcasm were gone, replaced by a look of open, unguarded vulnerability. "This treaty," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is the greatest thing I have ever been a part of. Not because it will end a war, but because I created it with you." He took her hand, his cool fingers lacing through her warm ones. My grand gestures were empty, foolish things. They were about me. About my power, my pride. They were noise. This is quiet. This is thoughtful. This is about building something, not breaking it. This is what love is, isn't it? Her eyes welled with tears. Yes, she whispered. This is what it is. He leaned across the table, across the carefully drafted articles of peace, and kissed her. It was not a kiss of fiery, possessive passion like the ones in the prophecies. It was gentle and tender, and full of a quiet, profound understanding. It was the closing of a treaty all its own, a silent agreement that their negotiations were finally over. The day he presented the treaty to the Vampire Council was a day that would be remembered in vampire history for millennia. He strode into the chamber not as a chastened king, but as a transformed one. He placed the treaty on the obsidian table. "My lords," he announced, his voice ringing with a new kind of authority. "The war with Eldoria is over. Not with a truce, but with a permanent and lasting peace, built on a foundation of mutual interest and respect." The elders murmured in surprise, their ancient eyes scanning the document. They saw the clever clauses, the elegant solutions, the undeniable political victory he had somehow crafted from the ashes of his humiliation. "This is remarkable, Valerius," the Lord Elder admitted, a rare note of respect in his grinding voice. "You have turned a diplomatic catastrophe into a triumph." "I did not do it alone," Valerius said. He turned to the chamber entrance. "I had a partner." Ilara walked in. She was not dressed as a queen in silks and jewels, but in her simple, practical dress, her head held high. She walked to his side, her presence a quiet statement of fact. "My lords," Valerius said, his voice filled with a pride that eclipsed any he had ever felt on a battlefield. "I present to you Ilara of Oakhaven. My fated mate. My advisor. My queen." He unrolled the final page of the treaty. There, at the bottom, were two signatures. His own, an elegant, ancient scrawl. And right next to it, in a clear, pragmatic script, was hers, Ilara, Queen of the Night Court. A collective gasp went through the chamber. It was unprecedented. A mortal's signature on a royal treaty, given equal weight to his own. It was not just a peace treaty with Eldoria. It was a revolution in the heart of his own kingdom. It was a declaration that his reign would no longer be one of solitary, dramatic power, but one of partnership. The elders were speechless, trapped by their own laws. The rights of a fated mate were absolute. If the king declared her queen, and she signed her name as such, she was queen. There was no precedent, but there was also no legal counterargument. Ilara had found another loophole, and this time, she had used it to build a throne for herself right beside his. Later that night, they stood on the highest balcony of the onyx spires, looking down at the sleeping city of Oakhaven. The violet glow on the horizon was long gone. The harbor was full of ships, peacefully unloading their cargo. The world was, for the first time in a long time, quiet. "Are you happy?" Valerius asked, his arm around her. "I am," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Though I'm already working on a proposal to reform the city guard's pension plan. It's a mess." He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "I would expect nothing less." He turned to her, his dark eyes soft in the moonlight. "I have one last gesture for you," he said. She raised a skeptical eyebrow. "If you've bought me a star, I'm filing for a celestial divorce." He smiled and produced a simple ceramic mug, steam rising from it. "It is tea," he said. "Chamomile. With 1 spoonful of honey. Just the way you like it." She took the mug, her hands warming around it. She looked from the simple, perfect gift to his face, and her expression was more radiant than any celestial body. "A+, Your Majesty," she murmured. "I have a good teacher," he replied, and bent down to kiss his queen. The gesture was small. It was quiet. And it was, finally, absolutely perfect.